Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Joanne Conklin, and I'm the director of the David Winton Bell Gallery. There we go. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture this evening by Chris Elphick, entitled Canaries in the Saltmarsh. The lecture is organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, which is by Snæbjörnsdóttir and Wilson and is called The Only Show in Town, which deals with the plight of the Saltmarsh sparrow here on the East Coast. And if you haven't had a chance to look, the gallery will be open when we finish. Chris was introduced to birding at a very early age, and he shared with me one of his earliest memories of growing up in Cheshire, England. He was out with his father, and Chris's job was to flush some birds into a mist net. And he had, on one hand, great success flushing 12 long-eared owls from an orchard. But on the other hand, he remembers watching as all 12 birds flew over the nests and off into the distance. And he thinks he was about 5. So pretty good start to a birding career, I think. Chris has since received a PhD from the University of Nevada in Reno and is currently associate professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UConn. His work focuses on the conservation ecology of birds, especially in wetlands, farmlands, and forests. And most pertinent to us this evening, he's been studying coastal marsh birds and their habitat since 2002, and is the lead investigator of SHARP, the Saltmarsh Habitat and Avian Research Program, which is a collaborative initiative that works to study ecology and conservation of tidal marsh birds. Chris is the recipient of Partner in Flight Research Awards, both for his individual work and as a member of the SHARP team. His research has been published in journals such as AUK, Biological Conservation, Condor, Conservation Biology, and Science magazine. And his book-length projects include The Sibley's Guide to Bird Life and Behavior, the Atlas of the Breeding Birds of Nevada, and the Ecology and Conservation of Birds in Rice Fields, a global review. So please join me in welcoming Chris Elphick.
Thank you. I will say that we did not know the owls were there. We were not trying to flush them. They just happened to be in the orchard and they flew out on us. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk today about climate change, and I particularly like this cover from The Economist magazine because I think it pretty much sums up where we're at. We have to figure out how to deal with it. It's happening. It's going to continue to happen. The effects are likely to be quite severe, and we have to adapt if we're going to cope with it, both us as humans, but also all of the other organisms that live on the planet. In the context of saltmarsh sparrows and the things I'm going to talk about today, sea level rise is the manifestation of climate change that's particularly relevant. We know that sea level rise is going to continue to go up. The different lines on this graph show a variety of different policy scenarios for the future, depending on what we as a global society decide to do. I would point out, I don't know if this pointer works. This is what will happen if all carbon emissions stopped 3 years ago. That did not happen, but the point is that even if we were able to stop all carbon emissions, sea level is going to keep going up because of carbon that is already in the atmosphere and warming that is already happening or has already happened. That's the legacy of what has happened in the past. So even if things change dramatically in the next few years, which is maybe not that likely, we still are going to have to deal with a lot of these changes that are happening. And so in particular, I want to talk about what this means for coastal marshes and for the organisms that live in them. And I'm going to kind of talk in 3 different parts in my talk. I'll talk first about the birds. This is a saltmarsh sparrow. Then I'll talk a little bit about marshes and how they're changing and what that means for the birds and for other things. And at the end, I'll close by coming back around to us and our role in this, both in the way that we're affected and also the things that we can do. So I got introduced to saltmarsh sparrows in a research sense in 2002, so it's been a long time, and have worked on them in marshes throughout Connecticut over a number of years. We've caught a lot of birds, put little bands on their legs so we know who's who and we can track them around. We found a lot of nests. We've tracked those nests to see what causes them to fail, what causes them to succeed, and how those things change depending on where they are in a marsh and how they've changed over time. But in 2010, kind of my purview and my kind of sense of this species really broadened when I got together with a group of other researchers up and down the East Coast to form what we call SHARP, which is the Saltmarsh Habitat and Avian Research Program. And I should point out that I am one of the co-PIs. We have no leader. Sometimes that's more apparent than others. But we work collaboratively. We have teams at several different universities up and down the East Coast. And collectively, we have had a lot of graduate students and postdocs and other researchers go through our labs who've all been a part of everything I'm going to talk about. So this is very much work that's been done by a cast of many. And we've also had a lot of organizations that we've collaborated with, who've supported us, who've used our data, and so I just want to recognize some of that here too. This is part of the SHARP team. This photo is from about 4 or 5 years ago, but it includes most of, or all of the kind of lead investigators, and I've highlighted with the little circles the people who have worked in our labs, who've done a lot of the data analysis and the work behind what I'm going to talk about today. In particular, Chris Field, who was a grad student in my lab and then a postdoc in my lab. Mo Carell, who got her PhD up at the University of Maine. Kate Ruskin, who got a PhD at the University of Maine and then came to my lab at the University of Connecticut to postdoc, and then Brian Klingbeil, who was also a postdoc in my lab. Everyone else here has also done lots and lots of work, but I'd be here forever if I named them all. But these people in particular are key to the stuff I'm going to talk about. So I like to start with this picture because it really kind of sums up what goes on in these marshes. So this is Hammonasset State Park in coastal Connecticut. And most people go to Hammonasset for the beach. It's the one really accessible beach in Connecticut. But much of the park is saltmarsh, and you can see all that here. And this is what it looks like, not during a hurricane, not during an extreme nor'easter, but just on a high spring tide. This happens every month. This is normal. This is what happens in salt marshes. This is not sea level rise. This is just marshes get flooded. And on a big tide, which happen around the full moon or the new moon, the tide can cover much of the marsh. And if you're a bird who has a nest right here, you can imagine that on a high tide, your nest is going to be pretty wet. And that's something these birds have had to deal with pretty much forever. So they have experience handling flooding. It's part of what they're evolved to deal with. And to kind of go from the really big picture into kind of the very specific picture, this is one of those nests. This is a video that was taken by one of the PhD students in my lab, Sam Apgar, as part of her PhD research. And I'm going to run this video and show you what happens during these high tides. So this is a sped up video. It's about 90 minutes of footage compressed into about 30 seconds. You can see the nest here with some eggs in it. There's a little bit of water in the nest already. The tide is coming up, and then this is going to show what happens through the rest of the tide cycle. Oh, and I should say that it's kind of purpley because the video is taken at night. Often the highest tides happen at night, so we use these infrared cameras. And in order to get cameras that work really well, Sam had to find a paranormal website that was selling cameras for finding ghosts. So if you see anything weird in the corner, that might be why. Okay. So you can see the tide coming up, the eggs bobbing around. Tide has peaked, and now the water's dropping down again. And at the end of it all, the female comes back in, sits back on the nest, incubates, warms the eggs back up again, and eventually they'll hatch. They'll be just fine. So this is normal. This is part of their lives. And this can happen multiple times during a nesting cycle. And as long as the eggs stay in the nest, they're just fine. They can get cold, they can get wet. The female, they're only underwater for an hour or so. The female will warm them back up, and then they'll continue to develop. The problem is that if the tide gets high enough, that those eggs kind of float over the edge of the nest, they wash out. So here you can see an egg down here at the bottom, and you can see where the nest is. This is at high tide. It's washed out of the nest. There is no way for that bird to get that egg back into the nest. You know, the simplest way to kind of explain that is, you know, birds don't have hands. So if you put an egg down there and you have to get it back into your nest, how are you going to do it if you don't have any hands? You have your beak, you have your feet, and they just don't have the capacity to do it. And so that egg is going to die and will not. And if all of the eggs get washed out of the nest, the bird does not get to reproduce. When the chicks hatch, the chicks kind of face a similar problem. If the water comes up, if they're relatively old, like this one's probably about 8 or 9 days old, well, 7 or 8 days, I guess, they can climb out of the nest, and as long as there's vegetation that they can climb up in, then they can survive the tide waters. But if they're young, if they've only been out of the nest for a couple of days, they don't have the capacity to climb, so they drown. If the water gets high enough that it covers all of the vegetation, they drown. And so on really big tides, a lot of these chicks drown. And again, this is something that's probably happened throughout their evolutionary history. You know, lots of baby birds die. And that's normal. If it's not tides, it's predators. That's a natural thing for lots of young birds to die during the early stages of their lives. Now, these birds, they nest in these marshes, but a marsh to you or to someone just going out who's not very familiar with marsh ecology might just look like an expanse of green. It's just a bunch of, you know, wet grass. It all looks pretty similar. But there's a lot going on here. So you can see there's actually several different types of vegetation here. There's a kind of fairly sparse vegetation here with bits of mud. Here it's denser, and this is a different species of plant. Because I am familiar with the marshes, I can tell you there's actually 2 different types of plants here. And these are plants that grow at slightly higher elevations. And I mean just a couple of inches. It can really change which plants grow there, and that tells the birds where it's safer to nest and where it's not. So a saltmarsh sparrow would not nest down here because it knows that it's a lower elevation than it is up here. And that on a tide, the tide water will certainly cover this, but it might not cover all of this. And so they use this information to figure out where to nest. And so they're not nesting anywhere in a marsh. They're nesting in the places where the vegetation is telling them that it's a slightly higher elevation. So these birds have to deal with this flooding. As I say, it's a normal part of their lives. And so what they have to deal with is the fact that tide heights go up and down. So what I have here, this is the height. Each of these dots represents the height of the highest water on a given day. And tides go up and down every day. So we're just showing the very high point of that on each day. Now, as you move through the lunar cycle, the peaks go up and come down and go up and come down. So you get the highest tides around the new moon and around the full moon on this kind of 2-week cycle. And we call these high tides spring tides. They don't just happen in the spring, they happen every 2 weeks. And some of them are higher than others. So this one is high, this one is high, this one is not as high. And we tend to get this alternation of a really high tide, a lower high tide, a high tide, and so on. And the birds, these really high tides tend to flood the whole marsh, or a lot of it, or there's a good chance that they will. These will flood some of it, but not so much. And in between, parts of the marsh will get flooded, but those are the places that the birds just don't nest anyway. So these birds, they have this window of time between this set of high tides and this set of high tides that they have to get all their reproduction in. They've got to lay their eggs, they've got to incubate them to get them to where they can hatch, and then they've got to feed the chicks enough that the chicks can grow well enough that they can leave the nest and fly and survive. And they can do that. They have a reproductive cycle that allows them to just about fit this in. And this is, you know, the power of evolution. This has happened in a way that for them, if they couldn't do it, they would not be in these marshes. They would have gone extinct a long time ago, or they would never have evolved in the first place. Now, sea level rise is increasing. As I've said, these are data from New London, Connecticut, and show that since the 1940s, there's been about 1/5 of a meter of sea level rise. So that's, you know, a little less than a foot, but quite a lot of sea level rise. And that is continuing. That is going to continue into the future. And so if we add that extra little bit of sea level to these peak tides, so rather than the gray dots that I showed you before, now everything's up a little bit. The relative heights of the tide in comparison with the height of the marsh has gone up a little bit. You can see that that does 2 things. First of all, it means that there's maybe more days here and here where the tide is high enough that it will flood a nest. So that shortens this window a little bit, and it's a pretty tight window to start with. And then even worse than that is in the middle here, it could push up these intermediate spring tides to the point where those tides will also flood nests. And if that happens, it's game over. You know, there's just no way you can go from having a 23 to 25 day nesting period and suddenly have to fit it into like 11 or 12 days. Okay, so at that point, nobody can reproduce anymore. And because this is happening across the entire coast, this applies to every saltmarsh sparrow no matter where they are, because they're all in coastal marshes. So through this group of researchers I work with, Sharp, we've done surveys of these birds. So we have this reason to believe that they may be in trouble, but we wanted to actually figure out if that was really true. So we have this survey up and down the East Coast from the parts of the Chesapeake Bay up to the Canadian border. Every one of these black dots is a place where we go out and we sample, where we measure the number of birds on a regular basis. So we have data on how many there are in these places, and from that we can estimate how big the population size is, and we can then compare those data to data from surveys that were done in the past to see how population has changed. And doing that has told us two things. First of all, it told us that in 2011, 2012, when we did this big survey, there were between 50 and 60,000 saltmarsh sparrows across their breeding range. So that's a global population of how many there are in the world. And then because we have some old data sets, we were able to pair those up with our current data and estimate the rate of decline, and that's illustrated here. And what this actually turns into is a 9% per year loss. So to try to put this into some perspective, if you, let's say you have a retirement fund or a stock portfolio, imagine that declining at 9% per year for 20 or 30 years. That's not very good. And what that turns into is a 75% loss in about the last 20 years. So that's 3/4 of the population is gone compared to where we were in the 1990s. Now, to put that into some sort of perspective, I went onto the website of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which produces the red lists and deals with global endangerment of species. These are equivalent data for orangutans. So orangutans currently there's twice as many orangutans in the world as there are saltmarsh sparrows. And they're declining at about 1/3 of the rate. Okay? So that gives you a little bit of perspective as to just how endangered these birds are. So we've got this survey work that we've done. The other half of our research focuses on trying to understand exactly what's going on in individual marshes with individual birds. So we capture birds, we mark them so that we can track them through their lives and figure out how well they survive under different conditions. And we find nests and we track those nests in order to see which ones survive, which ones fail, what the overall rate of survival is, and the things that cause failure when it happens. And again, we've caught a lot of birds, we found a lot of nests across all of these different sites. And I should say this is the entire team. So we're working at sites from Maine down to southern New Jersey. But this is 5 or 6 grad students and lots of field technicians and many people's effort here. And so we can take all of that data and we can kind of combine it, and we can estimate how likely it is that there will be at least one period of time during the breeding season when they have that 23-day window that it takes to reproduce their young. So for there to be any reproduction, they have to have at least one 23-day window when their nests are not going to get flooded, and we can estimate that. And so the way this graph works is that if you're up here, that means you get to breed. This is a 100% chance of there being a window in which breeding is possible. If you're down here, it basically just means that it's going to be impossible to reproduce. And so this is what the evidence suggests projecting into the future. Now, even back here, it doesn't mean that things are necessarily good. It means it's at least possible to reproduce. Once you get to about 2040 or so, somewhere in here, 2040 to 2060, they go through this threshold where suddenly it will become impossible for reproduction to happen unless something dramatic changes. We do something to reduce the effect of sea level rise on them. And then to kind of show that in a slightly different way, if you take that 9% per year population size and you project it into the future, That's what these little dots are. They say the distance between every dot is a 9% decline. So we just assume that's going to happen into the future. The lines just mean that there's some uncertainty around that. We're not exactly sure where those dots should lie. So we're kind of acknowledging that and showing what the range of possibilities is. And you can see that the population is projected to continue to decline. And then this is that line from before that shows the point at which they suddenly can't reproduce. So this suggests that even though there's this threshold where things get really bad, they're declining even in spite of that. So things probably are worse than that previous slide suggested. That's kind of the story of my research. Every time we do something new, things are probably worse than we thought they were before. Okay, and then just to give one last piece of perspective here, I just said that there were 50 to 60,000 of these birds in the world. Well, that was from 10 years ago. If this decline has continued, and we're not certain that it has, but we have no reason to believe that the decline has not continued, we're already here. So if that's true, since we started this, we've lost half of the population. That gives you some context for how severe this problem is. Okay, so I've been talking about one bird. There's lots of types of birds in the world. There's lots and lots of other species. There's all kinds of people who don't care about any of these birds or anything. So why should we care? Why should we care about this one particular species? There's 30, 40 other species of sparrow just in North America. Is this one particularly special? Well, I think that there's an aesthetic and a moral sense that maybe we should care because people like to see them. People care about birds. And we believe that, or some of us believe that maybe we have some moral reasons why we should protect other species and other things that are on the planet. And for some people, that might be a religious belief. For some people, it may come from somewhere else. But there's another reason why we should care, and that's where the title of the talk comes from. So this is a coal miner. And this is an actual canary. And the phrase canary in a coal mine comes from the fact that coal miners really did used to take canaries down into coal mines. And they did it because if there was a methane leak, if there was a buildup of poisonous gases, the canary would drop dead and stop singing before the humans did. So if that canary stopped singing, it was a signal that you should get out of the mine because conditions were getting bad. And so the birds are warning to these miners. And I think that in just the same way, these saltmarsh sparrows tell us something about this larger system and about the larger conditions that are happening along the coastline that matter to the birds, but they also matter to us and have consequences for the larger system and in some case, and also for the people who live in those places. So so people in conservation have for a long time used terms like indicator species to kind of highlight species that tell us something about a system, and often that term has not been used maybe as effectively as it might have been, because often we don't necessarily know that the species that we're talking about really does indicate something about the broader system. But I would argue for saltmarsh sparrows, there's a really good case for that, and it comes for two reasons. First, they're really specialized. They only occur in salt marshes. So anything that happens to their population has to be due to something that's happening in a salt marsh. There's lots of other birds that occur in salt marshes, but also occur in freshwater wetlands or in hay fields or whatever. So if something changes with them, it could be due to changes in those other habitats. Here, changes to saltmarsh sparrow have to be related to things that are going on in salt marshes. And then the second thing is that they are representative of the entire suite of organisms that lives in these systems, because the thing that affects them is this flooding by tides. And when the tide water comes up, it covers everything in the marsh. So all of the organisms that live there are likely to be influenced by that water. Now, they won't all necessarily die. They won't all necessarily be affected as severely, but it's going to have some influence on them. And so it's a change that they're going to have to deal with. And that applies to everything from the plants through some of the insects through the other birds, and especially the other birds, because all of these birds nest kind of on the ground in the grasses in the marsh, where they could get flooded in just the same way that these birds get flooded. And to kind of illustrate that, these are some estimates of population declines for other species that also occur in these marshes, that are also specialized and are found pretty much nowhere else for the most part. And you can see saltmarsh sparrow at the bottom here with that 9% per year decline. And again, this comes from the data that we've collected. But clapper-rail, which is kind of a chicken-sized bird that lives in marshes, Nelson sparrow, which is closely related to saltmarsh and occurs a little bit farther north, they're both declining at about 4 to 5% per year. These two species, willet and seaside sparrow, are not declining yet, but there's a little bit of evidence that near the edges of their range, seaside sparrows are starting to decline, and we have some other hints that there may be some decline in those species coming in the future. So my guess is that these are species where it's just not happened yet, because these birds, they have different lifestyles, they do things a little bit differently. Some of them can cope with the flooding a little bit better than others. But eventually, if the flooding continues to get worse and worse and worse, it will affect all of them. And then there's a sixth species that's a specialist in these marshes that I didn't have a graph for before, because they're now so rare that we don't have any data for them. I mean, they're a hard species to study anywhere. This is a black rail, and this is its chick. This is an Audubon painting from way back when. And they're not extinct, they are around, but they are gone from all of New England. They're gone from most of the Northeast. There's a few remnant populations, or a few remnant birds in New Jersey and around the Chesapeake. And the birds that are left are all down in South Carolina, Florida, and on the Gulf Coast. And it's estimated that in the eastern United States, there's maybe between about 600 and 1,500 of these left, and probably at the low end of that range. But they're so rare that it's really hard to, I mean, they're hard to study anyway because they're small and they don't make much noise and they're somewhat nocturnal. But the evidence suggests that this species is almost extinct. And so to me, this is what saltmarsh sparrow was 20 years, or saltmarsh sparrow is now where this species was 20 or 30 years ago, but we didn't notice and we didn't do anything about it. And so black rail is now basically gone. Saltmarsh sparrow is the next one to go. Clapper rail and Nelson sparrow maybe next after that, and then on down the line. So again, I think saltmarsh sparrow are telling something about this broader community of species in these marshes. And then to kind of reinforce that idea, again, looking into the future, we have taken estimates of where there is likely to be marsh left in 2050 if sea levels continue to rise, and then figured out how many birds there are in those marshes. And so those are the dark parts of these bars. And we did it with two different methods, which is why there's 2 bars for every species. And the point is that the method doesn't really matter very much. And so we expect that this is 100% of the current population of marsh will decline to maybe 15%. And this is not guaranteed. This is the area of marsh that is likely to persist, and that's a specific use of the word likely. So the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has defined terms like likely and unlikely in a very specific probabilistic way. So likely, when you're using it in the IPCC sense, means that there's a 66% chance of it happening or greater. Okay. So if we want to know that we have at least a 2/3 chance of them persisting, there's really only about 15 or 20% of the marshes in the Northeast that we can say that about. The rest might, or it might not. We just don't really know. Our ability to predict is not good enough to say. But if we just take this, these are the proportions of the different species populations that will persist. And it varies a little bit because they occur in different places, and what's happening in terms of marsh loss varies from place to place. But it's pretty bleak. Okay, and then before I kind of move on to talking about marshes, I just want to go back to the point that it's not just other species that live in coastal areas. Globally, 100 million people live within 1 meter's worth of elevation of sea level rise. We're expecting that, at least that to happen this century, maybe by 2050, 2060. This has huge repercussions for people. So what we're seeing happening to these birds is what we're going to be seeing happening to potentially 100 million people. Now, obviously, those 100 million people aren't going to drown when the tide comes up, but it's going to displace them. It's going to affect their homes. It's going to affect their livelihoods. It's going to affect agricultural land in many parts of the world. These are very far-reaching effects that sea level rise will have. Okay, I want to turn to the marshes. So I've kind of told you the bird piece, but the birds depend on their habitat, and so we have to think about the marshes. And if there's one thing I've learned over the length of this study is that you start out as a birder thinking you're going to study birds, and suddenly you're studying all kinds of things you never thought you were going to have to think about, including marsh biogeochemistry. And part of my lab was set up for a little while to measure tree rings. We're studying people. We're doing social science work to understand the attitudes of people who live near marshes and all kinds of other stuff. So I'm talking about marshes. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago, Chris Field, who I showed a picture of earlier, who was a PhD student in my lab, and I started thinking about, well, what's going on in these marshes? We know the birds are declining. Are the marshes changing? And what's going on especially at the edge of the marshes? Are these marshes moving inland? Because every time I gave a talk, someone said, well, won't the marshes just move inland? I mean, hasn't that been happening forever? Because, 10,000 years ago, the marshes I study weren't there. They were under a bunch of ice. They were somewhere offshore, and that's true. So marshes do have capacity to move in and out as the oceans rise and fall. We know that. But what's happening right now, and how fast does it happen, and does it happen on a time scale that's relevant to the birds, were some of the things that we were kind of interested in, and we couldn't find very much information about it. So we wanted to look at whether marshes were changing, and I shouldn't oversell this point. There are certainly a lot of studies where people have studied one marsh and shown how it's changing, but looking at it broadly across a landscape has not been done very much. So we wanted to try to look at that. We wanted to look at whether forests are actually retreating in places and being replaced by marshes that are kind of migrating into the uplands. And so we set out this scheme. All the little black dots show all the places around Long Island Sound where we collected data. And then we looked at several things. So first of all, we wanted to know if marshes are changing. And yes, indeed, marshes are getting wetter. Not just one or two marshes that we know really well, but if you look across the whole landscape and you sample across that whole area. And so this is a fairly complicated graphic, but what I have plotted here for 3 different species of plants, each bar represents a different marsh. So we have 12 different marsh complexes that are the 12 big ones along the Connecticut coast. And the black bar shows how much the amount of this plant species has changed between the early 200s and 2013. Sorry, 2000s and 2013. And if the bar is below the line, that means that this plant has declined. That's the crucial thing. And Juncus gerardii is a plant that doesn't like to get its feet wet. It grows at the highest elevations in the marsh. Okay? And uniformly across all of these study sites, the amount of that plant has declined. That suggests that the marshes are getting wetter, because it's getting wetter, so that plant can't live there anymore. Down at the bottom here, we have this other plant called Spartina alterniflora, which can handle a lot more flooding. It grows at much lower elevations. And again, pretty much uniformly across the coast, that plant has gotten more common. Again, that's consistent with the marshes getting wetter. Spartina patens is also important to the birds because it's a good indicator of where they nest. And this has not changed in nearly as obvious a way, but partly that's because it's moving into places that the Juncus gerardii that is moving out of, and it's being replaced kind of at the lower elevations by Spartina alterniflora. So it is changing, but it's not actually declining yet. But eventually, we would anticipate that this would also decline. And a number of other people have shown similar things. Now, if you kind of know the East Coast and you've spent any time down around Delaware Bay or Chesapeake, you might have seen scenes like this. People refer to these as ghost forests. They're places where the marsh has moved up into the adjacent forest. All the trees have died because they can't handle the flooding or the salt water. And this is that thing that people talk about, marshes moving inland. So if the marshes will just move inland, that shouldn't be a problem. The birds should be able to move with them, right? So this certainly happens down around the Chesapeake. It's been studied a fair bit, but mostly it's studied where people see it happening. Okay? That's not a surprise. But if you only study it where it's happening, you don't know how widespread its occurrence is. You just know that it happens where it happens. So this is a lot less common up in New England for various reasons. But what we wanted to know was whether we wanted to know more about what's going on up here. So there are places in southern New England where this happens, and this is one of them. So these are some dead trees where the marshes around them looks pretty similar. Except these trees were dead 100 plus years ago. This is not due to recent sea level rise. This is due to something else. We don't really know what. And this is one of the few places where we see anything like this up here. There are some other places where trees are dying for sure, but it's nothing like what it is further south. And when we look across the whole landscape, so again, we went out and we didn't just go where we saw it, we randomly picked places across the entire coast. We only looked in places where we expected it could happen because of the topography of the land, where it was shallow enough for the water to move inland. We looked in those places and we found that for the most part you just don't see it. You don't see trees dying. In fact, they're generally bigger and growing better if they're right at the marsh edge. And that makes a lot of sense from a strictly botanical point of view, because if you're at the marsh edge, you get a lot more light than if you're deep in the forest. So you grow better if you're a plant. So that's not really surprising, but it does tell us that salt water coming in and flooding is not hampering growth, and it's certainly not causing them to die. And we also found that it's relatively rare to see marsh plants growing up into the forest understory in these places. It does happen. It certainly happens. Before we did this study, I was convinced it was happening. I was mostly convinced because I'd seen various talks where people had shown pictures of it, and I'd been to places like this spot here. But then I realized that everybody who was showing pictures of this in talks was showing pictures of this site. So again, I mean, it's not the only site, it's happening elsewhere, but this is a well-known site where this is happening. But again, if you look at it across the entire landscape, randomly picking places where it should be happening based on the topography, most of the time it is not happening, and if it's happening, it's just a very little bit. It's moving very, very slowly. So I'm not saying that the marshes will not move inland. I think if they give it enough time, that they will. They'll naturally do it. I mean, we know that. It's happened throughout geological time. But the data that we have goes back to the 1970s, and comparing the 70s to now, at least for the coast of Long Island Sound, we can find very little evidence of any kind of measurable movement of the marsh edge into the upland. So maybe it's happening, but maybe it's a meter or a couple of meters. It's certainly not happening at a rate that will compensate for the changing in the marsh kind of at the lower elevation ranges, where these lower elevation plants are moving in and replacing the types of marsh that the birds can handle. And so what that means is that all of these species that need to have this kind of marsh where they don't get flooded too frequently are just getting kind of squeezed out. You know, the forest edge, the upland boundary is moving not at all or very, very slowly. The seaward edge of the marsh, where the marsh goes from being marsh that only gets flooded once a month to getting flooded, you know, as much as every day, that is moving up at a faster rate, and you're just kind of squeezing out this kind of what we call the high marsh zone, where a lot of these birds need to be to reproduce. And it affects not just saltmarsh sparrow, but also willet and Peter's your picture, and the clapper rail we have up here, and then a seaside sparrow over on the side there. Okay, so what can we do about this? Because this is what we see when we go out in the marsh on a big tide. We see chicks in a nest that is largely underwater. And this is good. They're not completely underwater. This is a good sign. Okay, so what can we do? So this brings us to the last part where we have to talk about people. And I'm always accused of being a little depressing in my talks. I will try to be a little bit more upbeat in this final section, but there's only so much you can say. So there are a number of things that we can do and we are doing. So an obvious thing, and this is what people in conservation do all the time, is we figure out the best places to protect stuff. We figure out where they are and where the most of them are, and then we prioritize protection in those places, or at least we try to. And so we've done this big exercise. These are maps we've taken maps from space and we've put them into a geographic information system that allows us to code them and take every one of these different patches of marsh habitat and apply a lot of kind of data to it so that we know its characteristics. And from those characteristics, those characteristics include how many birds we estimate there are in each of those patches, and we can use that information to prioritize which are the best ones, so that we don't just go out and haphazardly protect land just because it happens to be there. We're sure we're putting our limited conservation dollars where it's going to have the biggest impact. So we've done this across the entire coast from Maryland to Maine. So we have this kind of ranking process. When you're dealing with climate change, though, there's this tricky bit, or this thing that kind of adds a wrinkle here, because the places that are really good right now might not be the same places that are really good in 2050. In fact, they probably won't always be, because we know that it's a very dynamic system. These marshes are changing. And so we've also tried to predict where there will be good marshes in the future and identify those sites. And this comes from a big analysis that we did in collaboration with people at Woods Hole and elsewhere, where we took estimates of where marshes would be most likely to persist with sea level rise, either keep up with the rate of sea level rise by building up the marsh surface or whatever. And each of these little graphs is for a different region, and it shows the proportion of all of the marsh that we feel is likely, again, using that IPCC criteria. There's at least a 2/3 chance of it persisting in 2050. And again, there's two different approaches, and so the difference between them doesn't matter very much. They're slightly different, but not dramatically. And these graphs, each one goes up to 50% of current. Okay, so this is a quarter of the current marsh in coastal Maine. We can be pretty confident will be there in 2050. The rest, it might be, but we just don't know. And there's some variation in space. So down in coastal New Jersey, things look a lot worse. Southern New England is pretty good in the grand scheme of things. So we're able to then marry that information with where the birds are now, and places that both have a lot of birds now and we have a pretty good chance they'll still be there in 2050. Those should be our absolute top priorities for protecting those places, trying to ensure that they persist. There's also a lot of work being done on the ground, not just kind of in computer analyses. And again, we're not doing this work. This is work being done by a whole host of management agencies, conservation groups, including a number of people in this room. But we're collecting data at all of these sites to monitor what happens. So in some places, people are adding sediment to marsh to try to build up the elevation. This is at Satuous Point here in Rhode Island. And they've also here planted marsh grasses to try to build up the elevation. This is from a couple of years ago. I was talking earlier with a couple of people. I'm not quite sure what it looks like now, but there's people in the audience who would know. People are doing things like putting in living shorelines. The idea here is that putting in these structures slows down the movement of the water when it comes in on a big tide. And when you slow the water, the sediment that's in it is more likely to fall out. And that will help build up the marsh. This is a place that when these were put in, there were no plants here at all. Some were planted here, and some were planted here as well. And you can see that they're doing a little bit better here than down here. It's just one side, it's pretty small, but it shows, and the reason is that the sediment is building up here, and it's not building up where you don't have these reef balls to slow the water. And that allows the plants to establish. So this is potentially a way to help build marshes. And then in other places, people are doing things to alter the hydrology of the marshes to influence the extent to which the water floods in and out. So, if we know that these birds are going to get flooded out, their nest will be flooded on a really high tide. If we could stop that, just the peak part of that tide, and do it only when they're nesting, it would be a very small change to the marsh ecosystem, but it could allow all of the birds behind, further upstream to produce young successfully. And so this is something we've also been talking about experimenting with as potentially a way. It's not a long-term solution, but in the short term, it might buy us some time to come up with other strategies. So these projects are being done in all kinds of places up and down the coast. Every one of these dots is a place where there has been funding to do one or other of these restoration or management activities. And so we are collecting data at all of these places. We collected data before they started the work, so we have a baseline. We know what conditions were like at the beginning. We have what we call control sites, which are sites nearby with similar conditions where nobody has done anything. And that helps us compare and figure out how big an effect the actual management has had. And then we also have kind of our larger survey to tell us what's going on in the broader region so that we know if these sites are tracking what's happening everywhere or if they're unusual. Our hope is that they'll be unusual and that things will be better at them. And so we're at these sites, we're collecting data on the birds, we're collecting data on the vegetation, we're collecting data on the elevation of the marsh, so we know if it's actually building up or not. And we're at the very early stages here. Most of these projects have only been completed in the last couple of years. But over the next few years, we'll continue to monitor these sites. And then I don't expect anybody to read anything on this slide. The point of this, so this is one of those things that you always tell your graduate students, never put up a slide like this that no one can read. But I'm going to do it here to make a particular point. There's a big group of people, scientists from up and down the coast, have been working through the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, which is an organization within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to really kind of take a view of this entire system and how the system affects not just saltmarsh sparrow, but also some of the other birds that are threatened within the system, and understand it well enough that we can figure out what actions could be taken to really change things. So, basically the middle of this is all the kind of the ecology and the biological stuff. All the stuff around the outside is the human stuff that influences those things. And by identifying pathways through this and prioritizing them, we can figure out what do we need to do out here with the people part in order to have effects down here with the marsh and then with the birds. And so we're in the process of trying to complete this work right now and prioritize things so that the things we spend time and money on, both of which are limited, are the things that are most likely to have an influence through the entire system. And so with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
You probably explained this, but for their 23-day reproductive cycle, thanks. For the 23-day reproductive cycle, they're going through a moontide in the middle there. What is the issue? Is it that once they're chicks, they can't sustain another one? I'm just trying to understand, like that graph you had that showed the tide cycle.
Let me go back to it. If there's another thing that I've learned over the years, it's that tides are really, really complicated. Because there's cycles within cycles within cycles in terms of what's going on.
Because it looked like they were able to sustain that one moontide during the incubation
So any spring tide might have a negative effect, might flood the nests, okay? But the peak spring tides alternate. So sometimes, so this peak moontide is higher than the one in the middle, but then this one's another high one again.
I see, okay.
And sometimes the highest ones coincide with the full moons and sometimes with the new moons. And that changes, that's another cycle that changes over like a 10 or 12 year periodicity. And so, right now it's normal. Sometimes these, if it rains a lot in coincidence with this, then nobody survives that. So in 2009, which was a really rainy year, it was also very windy, and wind actually has a bigger effect than the rain, but they often go together. There was a lot of onshore wind that kind of pushes the water up into the marshes, and so you end up with higher tides than you would predict otherwise. So 2009, it was like that all summer long. I had a PhD student in my lab was doing a lot of very intensive nest searching that year. She found 205 nests, 209, something like that. Those nests, I think 5 of them produced any young. Okay, and to me that was a real wake up, because that was this is an unusual year now, but this is a sign of what just a little bit of a difference, what a little bit of extra sea level rise could be like. Mm-hmm. And if this happened like 5 years in a row, then the species is extinct, because they just don't live any longer than that. Yeah. So did that help? I struggle explaining this because it's really yeah.
Hi, I have a few things to mention. First of all, I think that bird select the wrong location. Should choose somewhere else, higher elevation. I saw the same thing in Providence River. One year, those swan, they nested in the dry area, and all year was fine. And the following year, they had it in the lower elevation, and water came and destroyed their nest. And second is, of course, I was very young when we had the ice age. Everything was frozen. If temperature didn't rise, we wouldn't be here.
Well, we'd be somewhere else, yes, for sure.
Therefore, and within last
And the
100
birds
years,
were as well.
last 100 years, the temperature has rise 1 degree, which is a very small, according to the,
It's
the
very
temperature
small,
from,
but you warm the oceans by that much. It causes this much sea level rise.
yes.
So a very small amount of temperature increase magnified across all of the water in the world's oceans, because when you heat up water, it expands. It can lead to, a meter of sea level rise globally.
Yeah, I studied that when we were in elementary school. When temperature rise, the North Pole and South Pole ice will be melted, and the coastal all over the world will rise. Now, mostly we're talking about, eastern United States. Mostly they talk about Florida, but it is affect everywhere in the world,
Yeah.
and we really cannot do anything about it. It's a nature. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. And you're right too about these birds. I mean, at some level they do nest in the wrong place. I mean, it's not the wrong place if normal pre-industrial human activities were not happening, because they've been in that place for a few million years, or for a very long time. But they are specialized. They have, this is what happens. It's the problem with being a specialist. Specializing in something can be really, really good as long as the conditions that allow you to be that specialist persist. If you're the person who is really, really good at fixing typewriters, you can be the go-to person for everyone with a broken typewriter until suddenly there aren't any typewriters in the world anymore, and then suddenly you don't have a job. And that's what these birds are. They're specialists. And this is a common problem for specialist species globally. With climate change, things are changing very rapidly, and specialists are the ones that are suffering the most. But often the specialists are the ones that are most unique or most interesting, because that's why they're specialists. So, so do we really want to write off all the specialist species? I don't know. Steve?
Yes, Chris, could you talk about the predators of these salt marsh bird nests that you've witnessed or otherwise documented?
Yeah, so I have never actually witnessed a nest predation on a nest, because it mostly happens at night, or it certainly doesn't happen when there's someone standing there watching the nest. But the nests are vulnerable to predation. There are birds that prey on them, things like grackles and gulls and crows almost certainly come in and take eggs if they can find them. We sometimes see nests that have been ripped apart by a coyote or a raccoon or a skunk or something like that. So there are predators. Up here in kind of the northern part of the species range, nest flooding is far more important than predation. A lot more nests are lost to flooding than to predators. As you move further south, predators get more important, and kind of in southern New Jersey, it kind of flips, and there's more nest predation than flooding. Both are still important, but their relative importance changes. And partly that's probably just because there's a lot more predatory mammals in the marshes. There's a lot more rodents and things farther south. It's a more complex predator community. But yeah. Oh, and I guess the other thing I should say, there's been some really interesting research done, not on this species, but on seaside sparrow, which is closely related, down in Georgia, that shows that the effects of predators and the effects of sea level rise actually interact. And the sea level rise can force birds to nest a little bit higher, but that maybe makes them more vulnerable to predators. And so, these birds, they're dealing with this trade-off. This gets back to being a specialist. One solution is, well, why don't you nest higher in the vegetation? You nest in kind of, not on the ground, but fairly low. Well, you could do that, but once you're at the very top of the vegetation, every crow that flies over is going to see your nest and then eat your babies. So, they're kind of balancing these two things. Yeah.
The map you showed of the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, why do you believe the mid-Atlantic with the lower elevation and potential areas for marshes to migrate inland had a lower likelihood of marsh viability in, I think it was by 2050?
I'm not sure. That comes out of the Erica Lanz's models from Woods Hole. I don't know how well we've characterized the potential for marsh migration. To be honest, I've not worried about it too much from the perspective of our bird work because I don't think marsh migration is happening fast enough to do them any good by 2050. Mm-hmm. That may be happening faster further south, but there's a lot of people are now starting to work on it, but there's just not that much research on it is part of the problem. Maybe it'll be better than I think. I know if you talk to people like Matt Kerwin, who's one of the leading researchers studying this stuff down in that part of the world, he has argued that things are not as bleak as they seem and that there will still be marshes into the future. But I don't want to speak for him, but I think that he would agree that he's mostly talking about marshes, not necessarily the high elevation marshes that the birds need to survive. Mm-hmm. And very often what the models predict is there will be marsh, but it'll flip from high marsh to low marsh. Mm-hmm. And it will mostly all become low marsh. So if it's Spartina alterniflora, that's fine. That's the plant that grows in the low marsh. If you're a bird or any other kind of organism that needs high marsh, it doesn't really matter if there's still marsh there. It's the wrong marsh. But yeah, I mean, there's huge uncertainty. I really want to emphasize those maps those bar graphs do not show that there will only be 15% or 25%. It's that there's only 15 to 25% that we have a high confidence will still be there.
Okay.
Most of the rest is in what the IPC would call the as likely as not range. That's their wording, which means it's somewhere between a 33% and a 66% chance. So they might be there, they might not. We just don't know. And so everything could be rosier than those maps at first sight suggest. But from a planning perspective, I would argue we should be focusing on the sites we can be pretty confident about rather than the ones that are much higher risk.
So those maps that looking at Maine, New Hampshire, northern New England, probably because the elevation of the marshes are higher and that tidal range is greater, perhaps that's why they have a greater likelihood of being viable.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things that go into those models, including things like isostatic rebound and potential for marsh building and things. I mean, they don't include everything that we would like them to, and people are trying to develop those better models. But I don't actually know if you kind of decompose which of the things contribute to that. I'm not sure what the answer to that is. And it probably varies from place to place a little bit. There's one here, and then we can come down to the front.
Yeah, I just have a question for you. I realize the time spans we're talking about are extremely short in terms of evolutionary processes of evolution. But I was wondering, since you have so many nests that have been studied, and you look presumably at the survival rates from different nests, have you done any comparison of the nests, characteristics of nests where the birds survive versus the ones that don't as a possible, I mean, I don't know if there could conceivably be any selective processes going on for better survivability through changing nest design.
So we've looked. We haven't found anything that's a really good predictor. I mean, often what happens is, the big tides really just flood everything. One of the PhD students in my lab, the person whose video I was showing earlier, Sam Apgar, she's working on that for her PhD, trying to figure out that, not just in saltmarsh sparrows, but in a whole bunch of other species. To be honest, I don't hold out very much hope. I think it's unlikely that there's scope for that, but we're trying to do the due diligence and investigate it. But yeah, it's a very, very strong selective pressure. But but it's a very short timeline as well.
I was just reading about, Darwin's finches,
Mm-hmm.
that there were changes even year to year
Yeah,
in the beaks.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's not clear that the things that would need to, I mean, part of the problem is just, what would they do? Where would they go? I mean, they'd have to completely change their habitat and start nesting somewhere else. And then presumably the things that are already nesting there would be things that they would have to compete with. And I mean, it's a much bigger shift than eating a slightly bigger size seed that's required. But you're right. I mean, and again, it's one of those things that people frequently ask about, and we're trying to see if there's any scope for it. But my guess is not. Yeah.
Thank you so much for very depressing. First of all, who in Rhode Island is working with you on this research? Or is this
So we've worked with Nick Ernst at Fish and Wildlife Service at the Refuge for as part of our work. There's various people in the audience here who we kind of have connections with. They're not kind of directly in the middle of all of this, but Peter right there, wave Peter. And then a number of other marsh researchers around who are, and Deirdre and Steve, of course, who are working here in Rhode Island.
Oh, good. Do you see any slowdown at all in building development along the marshes?
I have not really looked at that. So one of the good things is that marshes are pretty well protected. I mean, it's generally pretty hard to go and develop a coastal marsh. In most states, I don't know the laws in Rhode Island at all, but most states have at least some and often pretty good protection of those lands. So compared to a lot of more terrestrial habitats, things are pretty good. And the flip side is that things that happen in the adjacent uplands can affect what happens in the marsh. So there's lots of evidence that the runoff of nutrients from development can cause changes in the marsh that are generally not good. So you could have development higher up in the watershed and have that be a problem. And a lot of that work has been done, right here around Narragansett Bay. So.
Yeah. Any suggestions for the average non-scientist? What can we do to help?
Well, yeah, that's the struggling. I mean, that's the hard question. I mean, ultimately, there's this bigger picture of climate change. I mean, ultimately, it is not about saltmarsh sparrows, in my mind. And there's lots of things you can do.
Yeah.
They're all little small things, and they feel hopelessly insignificant. But the reason that we have this situation is that there are millions and millions and millions of people doing millions and millions and millions of small things that lead to more consumption, that leads to more carbon use. So, and it's everybody. It's every one of us. It's not that one group of people are the bad people and one group of people are not. We just need to consume less. And every decision we make, and so I think kind of shifting your mindset where you're constantly thinking, do I need this paper cup or can I bring my own cup? Should I turn off the monitor on my computer when I walk away? Should I spend, this was a thought when I came here, I knew that I could maybe park on the street or I could park in a parking lot where I would have to pay. I didn't spend the 10, 20 minutes driving around trying to find a parking slot. I just went straight to the parking lot and paid. That's a little bit less gas, a little bit less carbon. Does that on its own make a difference? No. But if millions and millions of people make those decisions every single day, that's how we change climate change.
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah.
The title was the canary in the Saltmarsh.
Yeah,
Now, the canary down in the coal mine didn't have a chance to escape,
that's true.
whereas I'm going to make a big assumption that if it wasn't caged in, just brought down, that once it started feeling weak, it would try to get the heck out. So,
If it knew how to. If it knew how to.
if it knew how to. I understand. I've been down in the coal mine up in Nova Scotia, so it's pretty intense. But I'm looking at your graph here with the fixed presentation. Are you making it the canary in the marsh because they will be unable to adapt to the rapid change because of our carbon emissions?
Yes. That's what when we were talking about some of the evolutionary stuff, it's the change is happening just too fast for it to be likely that they will be able to evolve to deal with the changing conditions. I mean, you know, if they had millennia to deal with, I mean, these birds are probably almost certainly not the same birds they were, you know, 1 million years ago or even 1,000 years ago. You know, we know that organisms change all the time in response to changing environments. But that's not, it can be a very fast process, but it's often not a very fast process. You have to have the basic variation in the population to start with, and you need time for these things to happen. And I just think that, you know, for the birds to evolve in, you know, basically they have 10, 20 generations before we're predicting extinction will happen. That's just not very long. And then on the marsh side, I mean, the marshes could shift. I mean, that's the other thing, as I mentioned. You know, over geological time, marshes have moved up and down. You know, we were not, you know, the marshes I work in were not there a few thousand years ago because of the Ice Age. They were somewhere else, either out to sea or farther south. And the birds were there with them, and they would have moved. I mean, we know that the birds were around at that time. Maybe not quite the same as they are now, but something, whatever the saltmarsh sparrow of a few thousand years ago was there. But these changes, they're just happening so fast, and there's limited places where marshes can move inland. It's better farther south, it's better down around the Chesapeake because most of the land that abuts marshes is agricultural farmland. Up here, it's mostly very expensive houses. And so there's a very different perspective on what we should do to protect the infrastructure. So yeah, I mean, if they had the time and the ability to adapt, I think they would, but I just don't think that that's likely. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question for you. You talked about some of the experimental efforts to modify the marsh through sediment or with controlling water.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a project in Rhode Island that the Nature Conservancy did filling. I don't know if people know. I think it was over near the John Chafee.
There have been a few projects. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has done 2 on their refuges. One that Chris had a photo of at Sapowit Marsh in Middletown. Yes, Sapowit. Saturatus, excuse me.
Yeah, I know Saturatus.
The Narrow River.
Oh, that's the one I was thinking of.
Chafee, and then there have been 2 on the salt ponds at Ninigret and
Yeah.
one recently at Quantico.
So I guess my question is, I mean, even with these kinds of, if these are successful, wouldn't it take a massive effort to actually preserve enough marsh to sustain these populations? I mean, I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but when I heard about it, I thought, I mean, it's great to do it on a small scale, but what is it going to take to create enough viable habitat to maintain a whole population of a species?
You're absolutely right. Yes, it's likely to take a lot, and we're trying to figure out exactly how much that would be right now, and try to figure out just how realistic it is and which approaches are more or less realistic. I mean, I would say that most of these projects are not being done even primarily for saltmarsh sparrow. They're being done for lots of other reasons. You know, there's a whole host of other things that live in the marshes. There's a whole host of things that we as a society get from marshes, whether it's, you know, recreational use, whether it's the fact that many of the fish that the fishing industries rely on spawn in these marshes and require marsh habitats in their early stages. Whether it's the fact that having a marsh along a coast provides a lot of protection for the houses that are right inland when a big hurricane or a big storm comes. So there's a lot of reasons for doing these marsh protection projects that have nothing to do with saltmarsh sparrows or any of these birds. And largely that's what's driving a lot of the work that's being done. But increasingly people are trying to take account of some of these individual species that are particularly threatened as part of those projects.
So are you optimistic about, with all these different rationales for preserving marsh, that it will actually happen?
Am I optimistic? I'm in the wrong business for an optimist. I am optimistic that we will learn a lot that may help some aspects of marsh systems. I'm not terribly optimistic about saltmarsh sparrows. I would not be at all surprised if they go extinct in my lifetime. But I think that all of the work that's being done with saltmarsh sparrows in mind is not really just about saltmarsh sparrows. It's about this larger system, and that what we can learn from this work and what we can do with this work has potential to have much broader benefits.
Well, I just want to say it's really been fascinating to see what you are doing and how you're measuring. And so I want to thank you very much for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you.
And for doing what you do.